welcome you. Today on the deep dive, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, really. It's about how we all connect. We've been digging into chapter 6 of Professional Generalism. Great book, by the way, about developing broad skills.
It's got some interesting takes.
And this chapter, chapter 6, shines a really fascinating light on something it calls story sharing.
Right, story sharing.
So our mission basically is to unpack this idea, the concept that, well, everything we communicate, a quick chat, a formal presentation, you name it, it's all essentially sharing stories. But what does that actually mean for how we interact, how we learn? I mean, have you ever stopped to think that even a spreadsheet full of data or like a set of instructions is also telling a story in its own way?
It's a great starting point, that question. And yeah, what's really striking is how broad this chapter's definition of story actually is.
Okay.
It's definitely not just, campfire tales or novels.
Yeah.
The argument is that all communication, whether we're talking, writing, even gesturing, it's fundamentally about sharing these stories. I mean, think about it. Catching up with a friend about your day.
Story.
Presenting an annual report. That's a story, just told with numbers, charts.
Right, a financial story.
Exactly. And the chapter goes even further. It suggests that things we think of as objective, like mathematical equations.
Really? Equations?
Yeah, or even the raw data zipping between machines. It argues these are also sharing stories, just using different structures, different languages, you could say.
Okay, let's slow down there. So not just bedtime stories. You're saying the source argues that stories come in all sorts of packages.
Precisely. Structured narratives, yes, but also those formal presentations, symbols, figures, even colors and letters.
Wow.
And we calls this an age-old concept ingrained in humanity. Which makes sense, doesn't it? It feels deep-seated.
It really does. But does the chapter talk about whether some story forms are, I don't know, better? Or maybe more likely to be misunderstood than others?
That's a really good question. It doesn't exactly rank them like, this story is better than that one.
Okay.
But it strongly implies that the clarity and the context you provide with the story are absolutely crucial. Get those wrong, and misinterpretation is almost guaranteed.
Right.
So take a presentation that's just crammed with data but poorly structured. The audience might walk away with a totally different story in their heads than what the presenter intended.
So the how matters just as much as the what.
Spot on.
Yeah.
The delivery, the framing, it's all part of the story sharing.
And here's where, for me, it got really interesting. The source suggests our internal world, our thoughts. That's also story creation.
Yes. It talks about how we communicate with ourselves, how we observe people, technology, nature. All of that is our mind-building narratives to make sense of everything.
Like an internal monologue story.
Kind of. And even biologically, think about posture, gestures, nonverbal cues. They're telling a story too, aren't they? About our mood, our confidence.
Okay, let's bring this back to the professional world. The text had some good examples, right?
Yeah, really practical ones, like a doctor explaining an illness. They're sharing the story of that illness, where it might have come from, what it's doing now, what could happen next.
Right, the narrative of the disease.
Or instruction manuals for, say, your new phone.
Yeah.
That's the designers sharing the story of how this thing works, how you should use it.
Okay, yeah, I see that. Step by step is a kind of narrative.
Even things like informational posters. They use visuals, text,
Yeah.
telling a quick story about a product or an event or a safety procedure.
It's a really powerful lens to view communication through, but then it gets into the tricky stuff, the truth versions in these stories.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets a bit philosophical, maybe.
A little mind-bending. Yeah.
The core assertion is that any story we share, whatever the method, is always a version of one's truth, not the truth itself.
Okay, unpack that. Not the truth.
Well, the argument is we can't really transmit pure absolute truth. Not necessarily because we're lying, but because we're inherently story makers. So any information we pass on gets filtered through our own understanding, our decisions, feelings. And that comes across in our word choice, tone, gestures, everything.
So it's always subjective to some degree.
Pretty much. Which leads to this idea of practical truth. That's like your working hypothesis. It's the version of the story that's good enough based on what you know to act on. And you keep refining it.
The chapter used an analogy about art interpretation.
Yeah, that was a good one. Different people look at the same painting.
And see different things, get different meanings.
Exactly. They each have their own truth about it, which might not even match the artist's original intention. And maybe in art, that's okay. That variation is part of it.
But not always. What about situations where you need the story to be as close to one single truth as possible?
Right, like a patient describing symptoms to a doctor.
Yeah.
You need accuracy there for a diagnosis.
Or a witness giving a statement to the police?
Precisely. The goal there is for the story shared to align as closely as possible with verifiable facts. But even then,
There are limits.
there are inherent limits. The text talks about these unavoidable gaps. Gaps between what actually happens,
Yeah.
what we perceive of it, how our memory stores that perception, and then what we manage to recall and actually share.
So like a chain with weak links.
Sort of. And the chapter argues these gaps are just too variable, too personal to measure precisely and correct back to some original primordial truth.
Wow. And it even tries to explain why that absolute truth might be out of reach. Something about things we can't directly observe.
Yeah, it touches on that. The idea that we can't directly measure everything, like immaterial energy or maybe even deep motivations. There's always a kind of black box.
We only see the effects, not the cause directly.
Exactly. We infer the story from the tangible evidence.
So if absolute truth is off the table, this practical truth becomes really important.
It does. And you build confidence in that practical truth by gathering multiple independent lines of evidence. More sources, different types of input.
Comparing different versions of the story.
Right. You compare them against criteria, which, interestingly, are often also sort of constructed narratives themselves, like scientific methods or legal standards. It's a continuous cycle.
What about when the original storytellers aren't around? Like trying to figure out what an ancient author really meant.
That's a huge challenge it highlights. Or a deceased inventor. All you have are the remnants, the text, the artifact.
And people interpret those remnants differently?
Always. The example used is investigators trying to piece together the thoughts and feelings of pilots in a crash. They can build a strong, practical truth, a likely story.
But they can never be absolutely certain.
Never absolutely certain. That door remains closed.
But we still try, right? We try to close those story-type gaps.
Absolutely. That's the driver. If witness accounts of a crime differ.
Police look for more evidence, security footage, other witnesses.
Exactly. They gather more story fragments to build a more coherent, reliable picture. A better version of that practical truth.
It even connects us to statistics, doesn't it? Like predictive models.
Yeah, that was interesting. A model might fit the data well.
But never perfectly. There's always some error.
Always some error, some uncertainty. We set acceptable limits based on, again, constructed criteria. We can see if we're reducing the uncertainty, the gap.
But we can't know the true size of the remaining gap. The unknown unknowns.
Precisely. As it says, we cannot know what we do not know.
Okay, sticking with these gaps, how does our environment or how familiar we are with something affect them?
That's another layer, definitely. The chapter points out that the intensity of the situation.
Like how fast things are happening.
Yeah, or how complex it is, and also our familiarity with it. These things massively influence the potential for gaps in understanding.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of a brand new driver in chaotic city traffic during rush hour.
Stressful. Lots of input. High chance of missing something.
Exactly. Huge potential for gaps in their story of what's happening around them. Or a new employee in a complex business.
Trying to figure out all the unwritten rules.
Right. The company culture, the team dynamics. It takes time and lots of interactions, lots of story sharing and observing to build a reliable, practical truth of how things actually work there. The gaps narrow with experience.
Okay, so we've got stories, we've got the challenge of truth. This brings us to another really key distinction the chapter makes. Information versus knowledge.
Ah, yes. This is crucial. And it notes how often we use those words interchangeably.
We do, don't we? Information, knowledge, sounds similar.
But the source draws a very clear line. Information is defined as basically data we receive and store.
Okay.
It includes the meaning, the semantics, and the structure, the syntax associations, often shaped by other people's experiences.
Right, like reading a definition in a dictionary.
Exactly. Knowledge, though what it calls experiential knowledge, that's built differently. It comes from our own direct firsthand experiences.
Ah, the doing part.
The doing, the living through it. It's about the episodic associations we form from actually interacting with the world.
So reading this chapter right now gives me information.
It gives you information about the author's ideas, their arguments, their knowledge.
But it doesn't automatically give me the author's knowledge.
Correct. You gain the knowledge that you have read the chapter, understood the concepts perhaps, but not the deep experiential knowledge the author built up to write it.
Makes sense. What about like a classroom? A teacher lectures.
The teacher is transmitting information based on their knowledge. But for the students just listening, that information isn't instantly knowledge for them.
Hmm.
Now, the interaction in the class, the discussion, the exercises of that process helps build knowledge. But the core content being delivered starts as information.
So reading someone's research paper gives me information about their knowledge.
But not the knowledge itself. You didn't do the experiments, you didn't have the insights firsthand.
The source uses an analogy here too, doesn't it? About things we accept without direct experience.
Yeah, a powerful one, like atoms or oxygen. Most of us accept they exist, right?
Sure, science says so.
But have we seen an atom directly? Or personally isolated oxygen? Probably not. We accept the information is true based on trusted sources, on scientific consensus.
But we lack that direct experiential knowledge. We haven't met an atom.
Exactly. It's belief based on information versus knowledge based on experience.
And it even uses the example of parentage, right? Accepting who your parents are without a DNA test.
We rely on family stories, birth certificates, societal norms, secondhand accounts, and accepted information.
So what we know in that sense is often what we believe based on information, not necessarily what we know directly, experientially.
It's a subtle but really important distinction. And the chapter apparently has a figure, 6.1, that maps this out viscerally.
Yeah, it shows the path from data to information to knowledge and highlights where those gaps, those potential drops in fidelity can occur.
Right. So, okay, let's try and pull this all together. For someone listening, what are the big takeaways, the key messages from this chapter?
Well, first, definitely the confirmation that story sharing isn't just like a communication technique. It's fundamental. It's what we do.
It's central. Yeah.
Second, really grasping the subjective nature of truth in those stories. Remembering it's always a version filtered through someone's perspective, including our own.
Humility about truth claims.
And third, that critical difference between information, the stuff we get, and knowledge, the understanding we build through experience. We need to be way more conscious of that.
And if we accept those points, then it follows that effective story sharing, the kind that actually helps convey knowledge or build shared understanding. Well, it needs care.
How so?
It needs clarity, for starters. It needs enough context so the other person can place the information. And it needs sensitivity to who you're talking to, their perspective.
Because if stories are misaligned or the information is shared badly...
You get misunderstandings, flawed assumptions, maybe bad decisions based on those assumptions.
Right. So what can listeners actually do with this? The chapter suggested some actions, didn't it?
It did. Some practical steps.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, just reflecting more. Think about the different truth versions you hear and the ones you tell. Be aware of your own filters, the context you provide or don't provide.
Okay, self-awareness. Makes sense.
Second, actively try to distinguish between information and knowledge in your own communication. Ask yourself, am I just dumping data here? Or am I helping someone build real understanding?
That means providing context, examples, maybe opportunities for them to apply it.
Exactly. Foster the experience, don't just transmit the facts.
What else?
Ensuring story coherence is big. Does your message hang together logically? Is it easy to follow?
Yeah, a confusing story isn't helpful.
And adapting the story, tailoring it to your audience, their background, their culture, their professional context. Use language and examples that resonate with them.
Bridge those potential gaps before they become chasms.
Nicely put. And finally, it encourages creating environments, especially in teams or organizations, where reflective story sharing is normal.
So making it safe for people to share their perspectives, their experiences, their interpretations.
Yes, because that sharing process itself is how you build collective knowledge, how you get closer to a robust practical truth, and how you minimize those communication gaps.
So wrapping it up then, this deep dive really hammers home that communication is story sharing, fundamentally. And if you get your head around the subjectivity of truth in those stories and that crucial split between information and knowledge, you can seriously level up how you connect with people and how you understand the world.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about the last piece of information you took in. A news report, an email, whatever.
Okay.
What story was it telling? What kind of truth did it represent for you? And maybe what firsthand experience could turn that information into real, solid knowledge?
That's a great challenge. Something to chew on.
Definitely. We really encourage you to keep exploring the power of stories in your own life, in your work. It's everywhere once you start looking.